It has been fascinating to watch how progressivism and postmodernism took over the academic spaces. And I think the right is mostly wrong about how this came about and how this was possible in the first place. The version that I usually hear on the right is that progressives are just so actively censoring every other position that other opinions don't even get to the surface, don't even get to express themselves. This has not been my experience with progressivism and postmodernism at university. I had the opposite impression. I had the impression that postmodernists were by far the rhetorically most skilled speakers I have ever met. And it came together with the fact that postmodernism is a relatively small toolkit, which is easily learned. It's something where I've had the experience of students, spending a few weeks or a few months studying postmodernism and then representing themselves as being postmodern and basically being capable of unhinging and deconstructing any other position that was thrown at them. I've seen one of the most experienced professors at our university, who was a Neoplatonist, being torn and shredded apart by a postmodern student who simply just knew his basic toolkit well. And the professor was, I think he was close to tears. He was in an impossible situation to defend himself. And I think this really comes with the nature of postmodernism itself. It was exclusively designed to criticize modernity, to unhinge modernity, and it was not built to criticize, limit, or in any other way fight pre-modernity. It was explicitly designed to basically bring down everything that we take for granted in modernity. And it looks something like the following. For example, postmodern arguments usually don't take for granted the life world. They don't take for granted most fundamental assumptions, like assumptions about causality, or the assumption that when I speak to you, you can understand me. So certain arguments go in the form of understanding is never the same. When you speak and when you utter a sentence, the meaning that you have in your mind can never be identical to the meaning that the other person has in their mind. Understanding is generally impossible. This is like one way of basically making it impossible for anyone to utter a position which can be consequential in the first place. The argument can be defended in many, many different ways, from, the brain regions that are involved when you're making a statement. So the exact, if you want, molecules are never identical, so two statements cannot be identical, yada, yada, yada. There are like hundreds, if not thousands, of different variations which can make plausible these basic statements, calling into question our most fundamental assumptions about who we are as human beings, about causality, for example. Causality is something that is also questioned and put into question in postmodernism. Another aspect, of course, is the ego. This is like one of the biggest topics in postmodernism, the questioning of the ego as a concept. And the result of that, of course, is if you don't have an ego, there is no one to say no. There is no one to say actually have resistance and to disagree with something. So, in other words, someone who is egoless becomes basically a tool to the other side, manipulating them. They can't have their own center of agency and so say no to something. And postmodernism was I think really, really, even if you look at postmodern opinion leaders like Derrida and Foucault, or at least those who are labeled postmodern by many, they were rhetorically extraordinarily well prepared, and they had done their homework. They were not stupid. They were not the way conservatives usually present progressives as, people who can't make it in academia. They don't have the necessary brain power, and that's why they resort to some form of censorship. That's not what I've experienced. I've experienced the exact opposite. That these are usually people who have been extraordinarily well prepared, and they've been almost trained if you want, almost warlike scenario where they are really well trained to deal with their opponents rhetorically very, very effectively. This has been my experience with the movement. And once you have such a tool set available to you, where it's very easy to call everything into question, most fundamental assumptions into question, and it's on the other hand extremely difficult to come up with something that is constructive and something that is unquestionable, indubitable, in other words. This is also another point that postmodernists are making all the time. It's something they took from Descartes. If you can't show something to be with certainty true, I will not accept it as true. And this is, of course, a standard of truth that I don't think even in the most exact sciences exists. I don't think, I don't know, I mean, I don't know how exact physics is, but I guess it's much more exact than sociology. And I think even in those disciplines, you never have absolute certainty. And yet, this is something that postmodern authors expect you to come up with. And if you can't deliver, they basically flatten your entire position. Or the notion of what it's like to be human, like that there are certain things that are more likely to be within your interest as a human being than others. They call this into question as well, and they say, show me what the human being is that universally applies to all human beings. Of course, you can't do that. Of course, that's not how we generally. This is not generally how reason functions in the first place, and it's extremely difficult to argue against those positions who basically call into question all the assumptions that you take for granted and everything that makes discourse and thinking together possible in the first place. And just pointing out that all of this is a performative contradiction, that the postmodern speaker who questions truth, assumes truth, is not usually not enough to convince students that postmodernism is wrong, because this itself is not pointing to a viable alternative to postmodernism, which would actually be self-standing and, and constructive itself. So this has been my experience with it, and from my perspective, it's perfectly understandable that postmodernism took over the academy, because it was rhetorically by far the best toolkit that I see out there existing, and not primarily because it was supported by political structures which enforced it. I'm sure those existed as well, but we shouldn't forget that the general problem of postmodernism still remains, that it's because it doesn't have a positive kernel, it doesn't have a positive message. It is extremely difficult to unify postmodernists around a specific idea. There is no specific idea. Maybe the only thing that I've seen occurring again and again and again and again is that nobody tells me, as Wilber once put it, nobody tells me what to do. The individual stands beyond everything else, and you cannot be expected to transgress the boundaries of an individual. This is, if you want, the highest taboo version ever. But there is nothing collective that brings postmodernists together. They don't agree on anything. If you look at the individual positions that they hold, they seem to be like all over the place. And this is why I believe that, for example, political unification for postmodernists is very, very difficult. It usually never occurs, except, again, on this one thing. The moment you transgress my personal boundaries, that's like you're committing, some form of atrocity. This is the worst thing you can do. The moment you use speech that hurts me as an individual, you are, out of the picture. But on the other hand, there is nothing that on the political level unifies postmodernists. And this is something you can, I think, see in the general discourse, that progressives have a very, very difficult time of coming together, because they're never capable of unifying. They're never capable of unifying around one grand narrative. Grand narratives have been flushed away anyway. Because the moment you have a new topic, if you happen to disagree on some specific topic, some specific issue, like, for example, the Israel-Palestine conflict, you've already basically separated yourself. The moment you disagree on one issue, you're incapable of solidarity with each other. And this is something that's more typical of progressives than it is of conservatives. Conservatives can get along while having relatively big differences between each other. This is not something you see in progressivism. Progressivism is basically a potpourri of the most diverse opinions you can have on issues. And the moment you disagree on one issue, you feel like you're not a camp anymore. You're not a unified political entity or social entity that has any force. But however, I think still the major point about why progressivism was capable of winning over the academy was not some kind of political conspiracy and money being flushed in. I mean, I could imagine there is even foreign interference, and foreign interference pushing postmodern narratives, because they are socially problematic. They are degrading social fabrics by basically taking everything away that holds individuals and societies together. And this is certainly in the interest of political adversaries, I'm sure. So I guess there will have been influence as well, but this was not the major point that I experienced from within. The major point again was that these people are extraordinarily well prepared rhetorically, and you can't compare them to, kids on the streets who are doing like street epistemology with Bogosian and look stupid and look like they have no idea what they're talking about. This is not the typical postmodern scholar. These people are usually well prepared. They know their rhetoric tools, and usually you can't really argue back because you would have to come up with a positive position on whatever, which is very, very difficult to defend. Well, they, on the other hand, all they have to do is call into question. The moment you make a statement, they have to simply call into question and expect you to provide the evidence. They put all the burden of proof on you, and usually you can't deliver. Usually, when you're trying to make a point, you have to transgress into a different discipline where you're not a specialist, and where you have to speculate. That's something that postmodernists immediately point out. So the moment you try to build a grand narrative and bring things together, they can point out, hey, dude, you're way, and above your head here. You can't speak about other disciplines that you have no idea about, so just keep silent. And this is rhetorically extremely, extremely effective. You can basically never articulate a positive position when you're facing such an opponent in rhetorical speech, because again, they expect from you a degree of precision that you wouldn't even find in physics. And yet we're talking about social sciences here. We're talking about having loose positions and oftentimes even just orientations and first draft thinking on issues that are relatively complicated and take many, many disciplines to be coordinated with each other. Like, for example, when you want to have an opinion on what is it like to be human, what is the human potential, if you want, that's not something that you can come up with just by looking at one discipline. You have to look at psychology, you have to look at addiction, you have to look at sense making, you have to look at sociology, you have to look at history. So many disciplines, and the moment the postmodern sees you making such a big grand statement, they have like the easiest time in their life of making you look like an absolute fool, and they don't even have to come up with their own positive version and positive image on the other hand of what it's like to be human. All they have to do is to show that you are incomplete, and it's easy for them to show that whatever you come up with is always incomplete. All right, this is what I think made it rhetorically so successful, and this is why you can't beat it on academic grounds by simply censoring it, because it never was that it through censorship was capable of becoming so all pervasive. It was mostly through its rhetorics, and this has to be faced on an entirely different level.